Hi, this is Joseph Palmer, the autodidact. It's February 22nd, 2023, and this is episode 3.2 of Diagnosed in ASPIE. We continue the topic of autistic masking. Last episode, we talked about the definition, and I had planned today to talk about how it is a health dilemma for the masking autistic. However, I want to first talk about the causes of masking. We'll get to the dilemma topic at a later date. First, a review of the definition. Autistic masking is a process of deliberate and rules-based behavior to satisfy social norms. It is to use echopraxia during casual social encounters, the copying of another's behavior to avoid misbehaving. Autistic masking has two common causes. First, autistic persons use masking as a coping strategy to live in a world of neurotypicals. The second cause is society imposes masking on an undiagnosed autistic person when they are a member of a social group that already sits apart from relative social norms. We will discuss these two causes in turn. Masking as a coping strategy. The intellects of autistic persons vary over a wide spectrum, but there are some common traits shared by most. One of these is that we tend to interpret the world literally and take a logical approach to problem solving. This is not always welcomed by society. Let me give you an example from my own early life. When I was about 7 years old, in the neighborhood where I grew up, I was out playing with some local kids. They were riding bikes and were showing another kid about my age how to ride. I hadn't yet learned, but was fascinated, and one of the older neighborhood boys, noticing, let me join in. I didn't have a bike of my own, so he grabbed a smaller, unused bike lying nearby and said, "Here you go, you can have this one." I thought, wow, my very own bike! I spent a few hours coasting down a hill on the bike with the kid showing me how to turn the pedals and use the brakes, then walking back up the hill to do it again. When it was time to go home, I was overjoyed with my new bike skills. I happily started walking the quarter mile back to my house, taking my bike with me. I made it about 100 yards when the older boy who had given me the bike came running up angrily, accusing me of taking his sister's bike. Without further remark, he took it out of my hands and left me standing there speechless and softly crying. It was only perhaps 2 decades later that I realized I had mistakenly interpreted his phrase literally, "You can have this one," when he only meant I could borrow the bike. Though one of the more memorable, I've had many similar experiences during my day. Honestly, to this day in my gut, I am convinced he was gifting me the bike, even though my intellect tells me he was only lending. Yet this is how the autistic mind often works. We must suppress the urge to interpret the world literally. And yet, because that is so often difficult, the masking strategy we develop is to be quiet, lest interpreting something incorrectly, we blurt out an embarrassing remark or take a regretful action. The quiet autistic person sitting by themselves in a corner at a social gathering is probably at that very moment masking their autism. If you are not autistic, then I invite you to draw that person into an honest conversation. Give them a chance to tell you about their view of the world. On the other hand, if you are that autistic person and the situation has low social risks, then I invite you to unmask instead. Let people know what you really think. The second cause of masking is imposed masking. Historical statistics of autism rates indicate it is largely confined to the population of white males. But in recent decades, we've learned that this is not the case. What happened? Why such a huge discrepancy among demographics? I believe it is because of imposed masking. For many years, autism was diagnosed using comparative criteria, i.e., those who deviated from social norms in certain ways were labeled as autistic. The problem with this approach is that it depends on the perspective of the diagnosing practitioner. Suppose that professional is accustomed to seeing young boys from suburban America each and every day. Then one day they are visited by the family of a white girl, or an immigrant boy from India, or the family of a black boy who recently lived in the city. These are families whose behavior, opinions, and mannerisms are, from the perspective of the white male suburban mental health professional, already outside his social norms. So, does he automatically label all the non-white, non-male, non-local children autistic? Or perhaps he takes the less absurd option of telling the parents that nothing is wrong with their child, and maybe they just need to work on harder at some fill-in-the-blank, undefined course of corrective action. Or what about all the other odd people in our society whose behavior we just assume is because they are part of a different social class or culture? How many of them are strange and exotic not because of their origins, but because they are actually an autistic person walking around with a mask imposed on them by society? Imposed masking is probably the reason I went undiagnosed for so many years. Being a white American male from the middle class is the only normal thing about my background. I am a devout Mormon who grew up on an island in rural Alaska and went to tiny public schools where I was a good student and standout musician. I served as a missionary for 2 years in a foreign country. 3 times I was denied entry into the military due to chronic health problems. I spent 10 years in college earning a PhD in engineering, then 13 years working for a remote national laboratory in rural northern New Mexico. Others owed all my odd behaviors, and there are many, to my naturally eccentric personality and diverse background. Finally, when I made a big career move 2 years ago to a new job at a large American corporation, I found myself in a situation where I could no longer mask my undiagnosed autism. And soon thereafter, I suffered my most severe recent autistic burnout. My friends, with that, I hope you have a better understanding of why we autistic persons mask. It is not an illness. Whether as a coping strategy or because it's imposed by society, we use masking to fit into a society where we desperately want to belong, where we want to have a purpose, and where we want to find happiness. If you enjoyed this episode, then please press the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. In 2 days, I will release the next segment of this episode on autistic masking. This is Joseph Palmer, the autodidact. Keep learning.